Hello, I'm Giles Bailey, a policy advisor at Nova, a mobility management company working globally. As part of our industry engagement and thought leadership work, we've been running a series of webinars on the most topical mobility issues. This is our 11th, and the others are available via our website. The Australian micromobility market is robust and expanding, and there's significant variation across the country in local markets. Following the substantial period of COVID-19 lockdowns, what can the wider world learn from the shared micromobility market and the Australian experience? Are there unique insights and perspectives that can be reapplied to other markets? And will we see new micromobility business models emerging from this continent? Again, a few thoughts to get us started. Wait, my screen here. Again, lots going on in terms of shared micromobility across Australia, both in bicycles and in scooters. And again, quite significant variations in various markets. We're also seeing some local and regional operators operating in Australia that are not present in Europe or North America and in other markets. It's also quite interesting in terms of the variation across the country and the local states taking quite differing actually attitudes to shared micromobility in terms of regulation, use, and provision of public support across the various states. So today we're going to have two short presentations from our guests, so approximately 10 minutes, followed by discussion, and then a wider discussion across all of the participants. As this event is being pre-recorded, we won't have the ability to have live questions from the audience. That said, please do get in touch with Nova to further discuss the issues that we've raised or for any of the presentations in detail. We'll finish off then with some final thoughts from our participants. To get us started, I would like to welcome Stephen Coulter. He is a co-founder of Zippity and Localift. These businesses deliver solutions for micromobility, shared mobility, trust as a service, end-to-end mobility payments, and interoperability between transport operators. Stephen is a customer-focused, data-driven leader with many years of experience in financial services, transport, telecommunications, and travel. He has worked and lived in Australia, Asia, the US, and Mexico. Over to you, Stephen.
Good morning. It's good to be here, Jean. Good morning also to Ali. I'm going to give you a very quick overview of where micromobility is in Australia at the moment to set the platform for questions later. And here you can see a couple of the more unusual types of micromobility. These are photos I've taken myself. On the left, you can see an Australian surfer with his two surfboards riding an electric uni-wheel, something you can't readily do with two surfboards on a bike or on a scooter. And on the right, someone riding one of his high unicycle uni-wheels along the beach in Manly, Australia. So we can go to the next slide and we'll get on to the more traditional form of micromobility. So micromobility in Australia is really caught up in a lot of regulation. We've got a very complex government system that we can thank the UK for due to when Australia was settled and the federal system that we have. So we actually have one federal government that sets the laws for vehicle standards, for import, etc. We have 8 state governments who are in charge of road rules in each of their states. And then we have 563 local governments around Australia who who implement any projects and transport activities, including shared micromobility trials. And they take the road rules their state has and decide how they want to apply them at a local government level. And this has created some real confusion around Australia because we still have the largest state, New South Wales, where electric scooters and all forms of electric personal mobility devices are still illegal. You can't use them in public spaces. There are no shared operators in New South Wales of electric scooters. There's talk it might happen the next year, but certainly nothing now. If you go beyond New South Wales, the state to the north of New South Wales, Queensland, is probably the most advanced. It's had electric personal mobility devices as a legal form of transport since 2018. and they've had a number of trials over that period, and it's beyond trial stage now, and there are multiple cities in Queensland with shared mobility happening right now. There's also large sales of privately owned electric scooters, electric skateboards, and all forms of electric personal mobility devices. The other states, Tasmania at the very bottom and Western Australia on the west coast, have only legalised electric scooters since December. So they're very new, but you can both ride privately owned, and there are rental shared fleets in both those states as well. But the red centre, the Northern Territory, South Australia and Victoria, they're still in trial mode with electric shared fleets, and privately owned scooters and other forms of personal mobility devices are still strictly illegal to be used in those three states. So there's little harmonisation of our laws. There's poor harmonisation with international standards, and the governments are not providing any tax incentives or rebates to encourage active transport in Australia at this time. Next slide, Jean. Part of some of the problems that's causing is that Australian vehicle standards don't actually make a lot of sense, and they're not consistent with European or US standards. Bikes and personal mobility devices are regulated quite differently and have different road use rules. Throttle-powered bikes are legal in Australia, yet they're probably the best-selling bikes in the US at the moment. And for instance, none of RadPower's bikes in the US or Europe would actually be legal in Australia. Speed pedelecs, which have a real role and are popular and are a legal category in Europe, are illegal in Australia. And the latest models of scooters, which have gone to having bigger decks and bigger wheels, which make them longer, are all technically illegal in Australia because Australia has a legal limit of 125 centimetres on the length of a scooter. So we're actually compromising Australia from having the best and safest devices by having laws that are being prepared by public servants who don't actually understand the space very well. You've got some basic differences I've shown here, the length I've spoken about. But if you look at bikes versus PMDs, bikes have a strict limit of 250 watts in power. EPMDs can have whatever power they like, as long as they're speed limited to 25 kilometers an hour. Bikes are limited to 25 kilometers per hour by motor, but if you want to pedal them, you can ride them whatever speed you like. If you look at throttles, they're not allowed on bikes at all, but every PMD has a throttle, and that's pretty much the only way to ride most of them. So, and as we said, there's no length limit on a bike, but there is on EPMDs and particular scooters, which is causing some issues now as well. Next slide, Jean.
Sorry, just a second.
So here's the Australian shared micromobility market, and you'll see on the left there are three operators which really have about 90% market share in Australia and similarly in New Zealand. And the three are Neuron, which is Singapore-based, but has raised a lot of its funding from venture capitalists within Australia. So they're from Singapore, they have operations in Asia. They've been very successful in Australia and New Zealand. They're also one of the participants in the UK trials, and they also have been having trials in Canada. So Neuron are probably the most global of these ones. They're Singapore-based, but have operations in Europe and North America as well. Beam are also out of Singapore and have operations in Asia and have been quite successful in both Australia and New Zealand. And Lime is the third one here, and unlike other parts of the world, they're the third player here. They were the first into Australia, and that in some ways we think didn't help Lime. They were first into Queensland with Brisbane as their initial market, likewise in Adelaide. But when those tenders went around the second time, they didn't win those tenders. They went to Neuron and Beam. And I think part of the problem Lime had was the first to market copped a lot of the criticism that we see around the world around e-scooters that wasn't deserved. And that made governments nervous when they heard criticism. So Neuron and Beam capitalised on that and won those markets. But Lime have just won the Melbourne market, which I think will probably become the biggest one in Australia within 12 months. and they're very active now in repitching to win back some of the markets they've lost and some of the markets that are still to open up. You can see in Australia, between scooters and bikes, there's about 18,000 rental devices right now. It's now growing rapidly, and we think that'll probably at least double, if not more so, in the next 12 months. Next slide. I spoke earlier about the road rules, and I'm not going to go through this slide cell by cell, but the slide is really designed to show how there's no consistency across Australia. It's very confusing for people to actually know what the rules are in their state. And from an operator perspective, they have to have very good technology if they're managing devices in all these different markets with the different rules and requirements that are required. And from an operator perspective, for the operators listening, Australia also has some of the strictest insurance rules in the world. And most Australian cities require operators to be carrying $20 million in public or general liability insurance. Above and beyond that, the trend now is also to require the operators to have rider, personal accident, and third-party insurance. So the base cost for insurance of that level in Australia, just on the general public liability, is typically about $400,000 to $500,000 Australian dollars, and that will have an excess of typically at least $100,000. So the operator is paying the first $100,000 of any claim. So it's effectively self-insurance apart from a really disastrous accident. And when you add in the other types of insurance that are required, it can easily be a premium of more than $1 million Australian dollars for your very first fleet, whether it's 250 or whether it's 500 or 5,000. So it's a real barrier to entry to other players in this market that don't already have that level of insurance, because unless you've got a fleet of 1,000 or more, you can't make it an economic cost of running a shared micromobility business. The other issue we're seeing is really just the two bottom lines on this table showing where private use is and isn't legal. And in the two largest states, it's like in the UK, it is still illegal to ride a privately owned electric scooter or electric personal mobility device on any public footpath or on any public road. And despite that, there's been over 325,000 sold in Australia, with around half of them being sold in states where it's still technically illegal to ride them in public spaces. So the same situation as what's happening currently in the UK and parts of Canada. Next slide, Jean. So where are we now? We think 2022, and pardon the pun, is going to be a tipping point for micromobility. We expect the states that haven't legalized it to legalize EPMDs, or at least electric scooters, over the next 12 months. We're seeing growth in numbers happen every month now from the shared micromobility space. We're also seeing huge growth in private sales. And Australians are adopting micromobility far quicker than the governments are regulating its approval. So that's got to be fixed because it's causing safety issues now by allowing people to purchase devices legally, but attempting to ban their use without any public education. We're seeing sustainable business models starting to emerge for shared scooters. They're getting better as the scale goes up. And we're also seeing other access models happening with commercial and private use. We're seeing subscription models starting to take off in lots of spaces. We're seeing big growth in commercial use, particularly in first and last mile delivery, whether it's for food or takeaway or parcels and other things. So the market is primed to really take off here. It's a great form of transport for Australia. Our weather is ideally suited to year-round use, unlike a lot of the Northern European markets. We just need our governments to get their act together and harmonise the laws a lot better to make it better for riders and better for pedestrians in the community, and integrating that with other road users. We'll skip past that one, Jean, for now.
Excellent, Stephen, and thank you very much. A range of questions, and I'd like to come back to the New South Wales ones, perhaps after Ali speaks. I'd like to hear more about Neuron and Beam. And do you feel they're bringing new thinking or new ideas to the market that you perhaps haven't heard of or seen in other markets in terms of micromobility? Is that differentiation, creating almost new thinking broadly that's kind of emerging in Australia?
Look, I think Neuron and Beam, when they first got their initial markets here, they learned from Lime being the leader here and being criticized over safety, which wasn't actually a Lime issue. It was simply more a perception. But Neuron in particular, whichever market they go into, they very much lead with safety as their feature. So their PR is all around safety. Their positioning is around safety. They run very good public education campaigns. They have good safety information in their app. And their scooters and devices are no safer or no more dangerous than other ones in the market. They're very good and robust scooters, and Neuron have their own in-house team. So they early on they had some of the better innovations. But if you look at the Lime Gen 4s, and if you look at Super Pedestrian or the new Bird scooters, all the latest generation scooters have very similar features. And I don't think Neurons are any better, and probably aren't quite as good as some of the latest models out there. But they've been very good at focusing on safety with cities, making cities feel comfortable, and supporting a range of safety initiatives in every city they go to. Beam, I think, also played to safety. They've got good bikes, they've got good scooters, and Beam and Neuron are often in the same two cities together. So I think they cohabit pretty well as operators.
And more generally, also across the cities, do we tend to see multiple operators in most cities, as opposed to either one dominant or one entire operator in the city?
Yeah. All the major cities in Australia, all the capital cities, have appointed 2 operators in each city, and the reason for doing that is they want to see different operating models, they say, and see how they operate. The Australian authorities have been quite cautious on numbers, and so we think they haven't allocated enough licenses. And when you've got 2 operators, it's inconvenient for the user, because I need to have 2 apps and carry a balance in 2 different wallets, and there's no interoperability. So in capital cities, we think a couple of operators certainly works, but they need to issue a lot more licenses, because you don't get the network effect with small numbers, and it becomes hard to be economical for the operators. And if you don't have enough liquidity of devices on the ground, riders aren't going to be able to find them close enough to be convenient. So we think that needs to change. When you go to regional cities in Australia, it's mostly a single operator, because the economics wouldn't work with 2 operators in a smaller town where you've only got a fleet of maybe 250 scooters or less.
Excellent. And actually, some other questions I'd like to ask you as well, but I'm going to bring in Ali at this point, and we'll come back to the others in the general discussion. So next, I'd like to introduce Ali Inat Hussain. He is a director of modeling and data innovation at VTech Leicester Consulting in Melbourne, Australia. He was previously the national director of future transport in Australia. Having worked in the country for the last 4 years, he previously worked at Transport for London in the UK for 9 years in a series of roles in planning and modeling. Welcome, Ali.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be here this morning. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is kind of zoom out a bit and give some of the Australian context that helps to explain where micromobility kind of fits into the picture in the transport mix, and gives a bit more of a context from that perspective. So if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So on the one hand, Australian cities are grappling with many of the same issues as other world cities. So if you look at, first of all, population growth, if you look at Australia's 3 biggest cities, you look at Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, they're all on the East Coast. Then over the next 10 years, there's 16% population growth that is planned, and that is around 2 million people being added to those cities collectively. And during that time also, it's estimated that Melbourne will become the biggest city population-wise, so overtaking Sydney. So there's a kind of a lot of change from a population perspective, and that population growth is going to be ongoing. And this is despite the pandemic kind of leading to borders being closed here for the last couple of years, essentially. It's still projected that Australia is quite an attractive place to come, and so that population growth is expected to pick up again. With the population growth and generally also a trend of kind of urbanization. So the third point on this slide is just talking to 72% of population growth being projected to be in cities. So there's increasing urbanization, and that brings with it road congestion and public transport crowding. And Infrastructure Australia has estimated that the levels of congestion and crowding will, the cost of that to the economy will double to nearly approaching 40 billion by Australian dollars by 2031. Now, the vast majority of that is road congestion. That's another kind of issue, but one that we see in many cities across the world. And finally, there's the imperative to increase transport sustainability to make the whole transport task more environmentally friendly and reducing carbon footprint. And just recently, Australia has now signed up to becoming carbon neutral by 2050. So that's an increasing, even though the federal mandates in this area are quite slow to come. Many states are kind of charging ahead, trying to make sure that the environmental angle is taken very seriously. So those are some of the things that are similar to other cities in the world. If we go to the next slide, there are also some important differences in Australian cities versus others that you may be familiar with. So first of all, there's a high degree of urban sprawl in Australian cities, and that's shown by the chart on the right. So what you see there is population density. Apologies for the missing label. That is in people per square kilometre, essentially. And so you can see that Melbourne, this is just taking some of the highest population cities in the world, which is why Brisbane, the third largest city in Australia, is not on here. But if that was on there, it would be half of the kind of density of Melbourne. And that just tells us that when you look at other kind of global benchmarks, there's just the cities in Australia are kind of far more spread out. Alongside that, and there's also a high income, and those two things. Australia is a fairly wealthy country, and if you combine those two factors, what you get is the 7th highest car ownership per capita in the world. And so that's another factor to bear in mind. And then when you look at Australia, just sometimes it kind of looks like a small place on the map somewhere, but it is a vast land area. So if you compare it to the EU, for example, it's 1.8 times the size. But the population is probably about 5% of the population of the EU. So that gives you just, although a lot of the cities are concentrated in the coastal areas, and there's not as much in the center, it's still quite a big place. And one of the things that we had Stephen talk about a lot, so I won't kind of dwell on that, is this kind of degree of separation, and also the kind of federal system that's in Australia means that each state has separate transport policy regulation. There's very little kind of interaction between the states when it comes to policy making. And these differences I point out because on the face of it, what they point to is outside of really the city centers in many places, there's quite a high level of kind of car dependence. But having said that, if you look at the major cities, Melbourne as an example, you still have half of the trip making, half of all trips made are estimated to be less than 4.5 kilometers in length. So that's still an important thing to bear in mind, that there is still a lot of kind of shorter trips that are made. So if we go to the next slide, and so when it comes to micromobility, I'd say, as kind of Stephen kind of already highlighted, that Australia is really finding its way, really, still. And there have been many trials across the country. And I just want to pull out a few facts from some of the trials that we've seen. So in Brisbane, the trials have largely been seen as a success. And now we've got kind of 12-month licenses in operation for kind of full use of e-scooters. But one interesting thing that came out of the kind of consultation process, and now in Brisbane, there's also an e-mobility strategy, which is great to see. Really trying to make sure things are all kind of linked together better. But what one of the things that they quote there is that the 30 to 50% of riders reported replacing car trips with e-scooter trips, and that's really important because for the longevity of micromobility and its place in the transport mix, it has to be delivering kind of against transport outcomes. The trials in Canberra, so Canberra is where the capital of Australia is. It's a smaller city, and around 500,000 people, but it is where the capital is and where the kind of federal administrative function and a lot of the government function takes place. But the interesting thing about the trial that was done there is there's just been a bit more data that's been made available. And so what you can see from there is, for example, peak usage of e-scooters in the evenings and on Saturdays. The most common reason is for use of them was recreation, which kind of and also half of non-users, which is an important point to kind of highlight, is half of non-users said there was nothing that could be done to persuade them to use e-scooters, which is an important, interesting counterpoint. However, on the kind of more positive side of the equation, that nearly half of users have reported using them for work-related travel, and generally the Canberra trial also has been seen as successful, and it's being expanded further this year. And just very recently, there's trials now underway in Melbourne and also in Victoria, which is the state in which Melbourne is the regional centre, 150 kilometres west in Ballarat. There's a trial underway there as well, which is, again, if you looked at Stephen's earlier slide, it's great to see in Victoria where up until now that the e-scooters have been banned completely. So while still finding its way, there's a lot of kind of interest in this area. We just move to the last slide, and I guess I just wanted to end with the context that, in my view, the future of micromobility, as well as the kind of all of the practical considerations Stephen mentioned, there's also, it depends on the effectiveness in solving transport challenges and also good transport planning. Both of these things are really important. So Australia has a lot to learn from other countries that are further along the journey, but I do foresee that a lot of the kind of talk around e-scooters is around last mile and how it can complement public transport. I think one of the issues there is that whilst e-scooters and the shared schemes are cheap in a sense, if you've got $1 for access, and then, for example, in the latest Melbourne trials, 45 cents per minute as an additional charge on that. Price is still an issue, because if you have a trip that's 5, 6, 7 minutes, you're talking about doubling the cost of a public transport fare. So that's something that's important to bear in mind. However, I think that where you've got the kind of densest part of the cities and where you're replacing trips, that is where we'll see kind of the highest initial use. And the other kind of key thing to note about the Australian context compared to many European cities is that cities don't have multimodal transport strategies by and large. So there's kind of a lot of unimodal thinking and strategies that they might look at rail, they might look at bus, but this lack of kind of joined up plans hinders micromobility, as it really needs to be considered and integrated with other transport modes heavily. So having said that, as I kind of highlighted before, most states across Australia have trials in place or about to embark on some. And it is increasingly part of the conversation with policymakers and transport professionals, especially with the potential to replace short trip, provide additional kind of modes for undertaking short trips, replacing some car journeys, but also taking the pressure of public transport and enhancing the competitiveness of public transport with the car mode by kind of increasing the catchment of public transport stations effectively by serving that last mile function. So yeah, that's everything I had to say for now.
Thank you very much, Ali. And again, before I get back to both you and Stephen, I'd like to explore a little bit more about this point of intermodality and perhaps the barriers to thinking about shared micromobility as a joiner together of modes. But also, again, is there no kind of thinking even about parking around rail stations or how shared micromobility might work around that user case? And kind of, so what are the barriers to that thinking?
Yeah, no, I think the barriers, I think it was discussed just before we started recording, and I think that's important. The problem is the legal status of micromobility in many states makes it difficult to incorporate and that thinking and talk about it in many of the kind of policy setting scenarios. So whilst now it is getting traction increasingly, and for example, that's where Queensland and in Brisbane they're most furthest ahead, where they are explicitly talking about prioritizing where parking can be, how stations and other transit hubs can be integrated with parking and service provision. The two biggest cities in Melbourne and Sydney are well behind because it's difficult to talk about how to integrate an illegal, essentially, mode of transport into the system.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. But I'd like to come back to this point again and bring Stephen in as well on why has New South Wales, Sydney not embraced shared micromobility? And if I couch the kind of question in terms of what can we learn from their decision not to embrace it in terms of the wider debate and thinking about shared micromobility? And perhaps if Ali, you start, and we'll pass to Stephen.
Sure. Yeah. So look, my view is that there's two things going on. The first part of it is actually the early bad reputation that this area had from the kind of early US trials, safety concerns and seeing scooters or e-bikes kind of piled up in places, adding to clutter, all of those things. And I would say that Australian society is generally one that is quite risk averse. And so I think it's the public perception that created it is one factor. There's the regulation in the first place that changes would be required in order to legalize these kind of micromobility modes, which kind of has hindered its thinking. But I would say on the other side that I am in the policy making context and in the kind of modeling work that we do and the work that we do in transport planning, we are asked increasingly about modeling the impacts of micromobility. So it is something that is part of the thinking. I think it's just a matter of a bit more time and the opening out the kind of regulatory environment that will kind of change that thinking further and lead to it being considered in a more mainstream way.
Thank you. And
maybe
Stephen,
if I can add,
yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
Certainly, I think Australia had a very bad experience back in 2015 with the first round of shared bikes that ended up in harbours and rivers and trees like they did around the world. And a lot of people remember that. And they don't understand the technology that's now in shared bikes and scooters, the heaviness of them, the geofencing, all the things. That's vandalism rates in shared fleets has dropped from over 30% to less than 1%. So it's no longer an issue. But in New South Wales, the fundamental issue has been politics. I was on the electric scooter task force that was formed in New South Wales back in 2019 that was Transport for New South Wales and industry people. And that task force recommended the implementation of shared scooter trials way back then, just as has happened in other parts of Australia. The New South Wales Productivity Commissioner did a very major report into the future for New South Wales and how that can be enhanced. And one of their recommendations was shared and privately owned personal mobility devices, because they'll add greatly to the New South Wales economy. And that came again from within the government. But you really had a regressive minister previously, Andrew Constance, who had an emotional issue against electric scooters and ignored the advice of his diplomats or his public servants who recommended them be implemented. He ignored the advice of the Productivity Commissioner. And unfortunately, he did a business trip to Paris when we had the laissez-faire regulation in Paris that looked terrible. So he assumed that would happen in Australia. And his principal advisor went to the US and landed in Austin, where a similar thing was happening. So they both took personal opinions of a personal bad experience and applied it to the largest state in Australia, and went against the recommendations of their own committees and other departments. Now, Minister Constance has left government in New South Wales, and Rob Stokes, the new minister, actually has a planning background and is a very strong advocate for active transport. So we would expect some common sense to start to prevail in New South Wales this year, with a well-informed and well-educated Minister for Active Transport who's very committed to change and committed to environmental change and reduce dependence on cars. So I think, politics is the reason New South Wales is where it is, and common sense, I think, is about to prevail.
But I suppose it is interesting in terms of, again, future new mobility options, this issue of public perception, politics, personal experience can really kind of impact what's rolled out in a city, in a state. I'd like to move the debate on to a bit on data, and data around new mobility, shared micromobility, and how that conversation is playing out within Australia. Stephen or Ali, who would like to go first?
Yeah, look, we think data it's one of the gems that governments haven't appreciated. They don't have access to the information Google does on movements of people by modes. And when they start to see the information that can come from having IoT-enabled bikes and scooters, and the depth of data in there that can help them with city planning, where to put facilities, where they need better protected mobility lanes or bike lanes. And the data is immensely powerful. And we're getting to the point now with platforms like Vianova and the other ones out there that cities can effectively have their own city cloud that can be updated on the fly and can control things like speeding, access areas, parking, and all those sorts of things. And with the heat maps and other tools, it becomes an enormous asset to any city in their future transport planning. And we think that in the next 2 to 3 years, the next generation of privately owned bikes and scooters are going to have IoT embedded within them. And that's going to give cities even more information to plan with. And I guess linking that back to one of your earlier points about unimodal and multimodal transport, I guess a couple of innovation things that link back to that in Australia. In Queensland, they have been doing a mass trial with the University of Queensland where you can pay for your monthly pass that will also include unlimited rides on Neuron and Beam scooters. So it no longer becomes a separate cost I have to consider for my $40 a month or whatever the price is. I can catch a bus, train, ride a bike, ride a scooter. It's all embedded within there. In New South Wales, where electric bikes are legal, Lime have done an integration with Transport for New South Wales and Cubic, who run ticketing systems all over the world. And if I ride a Lime bike to a train or a ferry or a bus in New South Wales, I then get $3 off the next public transit fare. So they're starting to play around with integrations to bring the forms of modes of transport together. And ultimately it comes down to your ticketing and the cost of it, because you need to be able to integrate those and not have specific costs for each mode, because that becomes a disincentive to use multi-modes if everyone has a unique cost that's, when you add them up, becomes far too expensive.
Thank you, Stephen. And Ali, similarly on that point of
Yeah,
data.
sure. Yeah, so data, I think that is one of the key gaps at the moment. So when you look at the kind of planning community and trying to answer questions like what has the performance of different schemes been, but also looking at where there's potential demand, there's two issues. One is that when governments are kind of licensing, offering these licenses for micromobility operation, whilst they're thinking about kind of regulatory requirements, often the kind of planning requirements are not thought about at that stage and thinking about which kind of data collection should we mandate, because of course there is an element of commercial sensitivity in the kind of usage data. And so unless it's in the agreement at the start, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to get hold of that in a way that can be shared with transport professionals later. And then the second thing is micromobility serves an end of the market where the trips are quite short in length. And that kind of trip making in general is just an area where there isn't as much data available, and that's a gap that needs to be addressed and plugged to allow us to recognize where the potential for this is going forward. Having said that, the way that that's kind of mitigated at the moment is rather than kind of looking through that lens, you just kind of do small scale trials and then expand them as you go out and kind of learn by doing rather than by kind of planning in more detail. And the other thing I would just say is that there's also an issue of kind of data standards and trying to kind of make those more harmonized. So there's there's specifications from been championed in the US and in other places, which it would be good if that standardization could be kind of committed to more wholly across the Australian market, so that then once the data is collected, that it's all done in a consistent way that's easy to use. And finally, I would just echo and agree with Stephen's point on mobility as a service, and that being really important for the thinking and the integration of different modes, and exactly as so that you can, rather than have a micromobility as a separate mode, is kind of properly integrated so that you're paying a single cost for getting from A to B rather than thinking about each component separately.
Excellent. And again, we're getting close to the allocated time, but I'd just like to ask both of you again, 2 years, 3 years time, or even perhaps slightly longer, where do you think shared micromobility in Australia is going? Or would you like to see, or what do you think you'll see in the 2 to 3 year time period? Perhaps again, Stephen, you go first.
Look, I think in 2 to 3 years' time, we're going to see all forms of micromobility being widely accepted and fitting into normal day life in different modes, and the market's going to evolve. The most active users are going to certainly have their own devices. We're going to see the range of devices grow quite significantly to fit different cells. There's a lot of talk around accessibility, so there are new devices coming out, both shared and privately owned. In the area where I live in Australia, we see elderly people on electric trucks on a regular basis. So that sort of stuff for seniors will become quite popular. We're seeing out of the US and Europe some of the new designs around bikes that are integrating into pods for weather protection will start happening. And there's a whole lot, we think really electric cargo bikes are going to be a really big growth category because of the last mile delivery and the services they can deliver. And I think as Ali said, in most cities around Australia, the average journey is under 5 kilometres, and more than half of them are less than 2.5 kilometres. And so that's the sweet spot for all forms of micromobility, provided you have access to devices that can fit the use case of those examples. So we think it's going to grow. The use is going to diversify. We're going to have shared as we have now, but you're going to see subscription models. You're going to have ownership, and you're going to have access models. So there'll be lots of different ways to access it, whether it's by the minute, by the month, or private ownership.
Excellent. And Ali, 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, look, I would echo much of what Stephen said. The only thing I would add to that is I think there'll be kind of two kind of separate markets in a sense. So there'll be the kind of most built up areas and the inner suburbs of many cities where we will see increased use and real integration of micromobility options into and shared micromobility options into kind of into the usage of everyday modes. When it comes to the outer suburbs, I think that is going to be where we may see more private ownership. And for me, there's still a question mark as to how much of a role shared micromobility services can play there, because there's a number of things going on. It also requires a change in there's often plentiful parking at stations in Australia, at least in outer areas. Trip lengths are a bit longer, and I think the costs have to change in order to make it worthwhile for those kinds of journeys. But having said that, I think those are the places where you probably see private ownership in place of use of shared services.
Thank you. And again, I'll go straight into any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience before we wrap up. I'll start with you, Ali.
Yeah, so look, my final thought is just that for Australia, I think the increasing standardization, at least, of regulation is a great trend to see, and the fact that we are on the cusp of having, well, we've now got trials in Victoria and having trials in New South Wales. I think they're important steps that will mean that the conversation about micromobility can be truly national, and then we can kind of realize the full potential of the benefits that these modes offer.
Thank you. And Stephen, your final thoughts.
I think much the same. I think we're going to get to a new normal relatively quickly. And then I'd really like to see our agenda focus on how micromobility can be productively used and have more public education around that, and focus on optimizing it as a form of transport in a broader transport system, rather than the public debate right now being about regulation, which isn't terribly useful or productive.
Excellent. So again, I'd like to thank Ali Inat Hussain from VTech Leicester Consulting and Stephen Coulter from Zippity, both based in the state of Victoria in Australia, for joining us today and sharing with us some of their thoughts on delivering shared micromobility in the Australian market, and for some of the current challenges as well as opportunities. Please listen to our earlier ViaNova webinars, as well as read our various white papers and articles, which are available via our website and our LinkedIn page. They contain useful information on new mobility from partners across Europe and the wider world. Thank you and keep safe. And you can find out about our upcoming webinars, both short and long forms, which will be available on our website in the coming days. Thank you and have a good day.